So welcome back. Again, I am Kimmy and I am with On William Street, and we do pattern design and long arm quilting. So I just wanted to share with you some of the process of how I decide what to put on the quilt. How do you come up with the quilting plan? Sometimes that can be the hardest part of actually quilting your quilt, is deciding how to quilt it. So I'm going to go ahead and share some of the processes that I use some of our different quilts. And if you enjoy what you're seeing, we do have more on our profile and we'll be adding more throughout the year. So follow us, check back often, and we'll show you all the different things that we're working on. So the quilt that I picked to go over today is my Christmas Whirl quilt. So this is our Whirl pattern, and it's one that originally, if you find it, it's actually going to be rainbow background with gray squares. So this is my Christmas version of it. I played around with the colors and loved the shimmery red and the greens, so I wanted to remake it and do myself a Christmas quilt. So when I'm quilting a quilt, there's a few things that I'm going to take into consideration, and one of them is always going to be time. Do I have a time limit that this has to be done in? And this quilt, luckily, I did not. There was no time limit. I didn't get it done last year in time for Christmas. I tried really hard, but I didn't. So I was finishing at the beginning of this year, and I have 12 months in order to have it done for next year. So time wasn't really an issue. And I'm also able to take quilts on and off my machine. I have zippered leaders, so if for some reason I had to take it off, work on other quilts, put it back, it would not be a big issue. So that was something that I wasn't worried about with this one. The second thing is, am I quilting solids or am I quilting prints? If I'm quilting a lot of prints, I'm going to look at the quilting differently. I'm going to probably go something a little more simpler, depending on what the print is. If it's very busy, you're going to lose a lot of the quilting. So I'm going to go something a little bit simpler in those prints. And as you'll see that in the original Whirl, and the original Whirl quilt, our stars were prints. So I went very simple in the prints themselves. However, on this one, it is all solids. So I was able to really play up the quilting a lot more. I didn't need to worry about toning it down. If you're quilting in solids, you'll realize that the quilting really shows up, and it can really make a strong impact there. So that's the second thing that I take into consideration when I'm designing a quilt, the quilting. The third thing is, also how is this going to be used? Is it something that is going to be thrown on a kid's bed and loved and dragged all over the place and snuggled up in, or is it something that's more kind of something less used, more of kind of like a show? If it's something for a kid, I'm actually probably going to adjust my quilting plan to be not quite as dense. This will, as you wash it, you'll even be surprised. This will, depending a lot on your batting, it will still soften up, but it's not going to really be crinkly. And also, if a kid's using it, it's likely going to get worn out quicker. So to put a lot of time into the quilting might not really be as necessary for something like a kid's quilt or a baby blanket. But if it's something that's more for show, go all out. And then also, of course, your skill level. Where are you at? So when I'm trying to learn new concepts or learn new techniques or new patterns, I like to throw 1 or 2 in small sections into a project that I'm working on, so that I have a chance to practice those and work on those, but I'm not going to be completely overwhelmed by the time I get to the end of the quilt. When we get overwhelmed, we kind of put off finishing it, and it takes a lot longer than it should. So if I know that 75% or 80% of the quilt are things that I'm very comfortable with, things that I do all the time, it's going to be easier to then really take the extra time and focus on those couple of sections that might be new or a little bit more difficult. So those are kind of some of the things that I'm thinking about as I'm working on designing a quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of show you the close-ups of this one a little bit. You can kind of see the quilting in person, and then we'll move to paper and work out how I actually planned the quilting itself. So you can see on this quilt, there's really pretty intricate, especially as you look into these white areas. You didn't see it as well back there, but as you get closer, there's a lot going on throughout this quilt. And like I said, the reason that I was able, or is more willing, to go completely all out on this one is because of all those solids. When you have a whole bunch of solids in a quilt, you can really take advantage of the quilting, because every single thing that you quilt is going to show and become a statement piece in that quilt. As you can see here in the original Whirl quilt, I had circles going on in the white spaces, and then I really focused on this long diamond shape for the square areas. Also, you can see how I did the simpler in the prints. So these are kind of some of the things that I thought, well, I want to do them differently and not just do the same the same shapes going on here as I decided on the quilting for my new Christmas quilt. So instead of doing the long diamond shapes for this one, I thought, well, let's start there and let's go ahead and focus on the square shape, the actual square shape, not the one inside the square shape, the square shape for the yellow sections. And that immediately is going to give me a different look than what I had in my original one. Also, because I went circles and kind of focused on this space here, I decided, okay, I'm not going to do any sort of circles in that area. So when I originally started doing this quilt, I was not intending to do quite as much ruler work and marking as I ended up doing. It just kind of happened. When I originally did this, I thought, well, let's see, what can I do without a lot of marking? Well, I'm going to echo around these lines like this. And then in these sections, we'll put a couple of them so you can see it. In these sections, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of do a funky echo shape. So I actually went to my quilt and quilted these out. And I hated it. It wasn't giving me the look I wanted, and it wasn't as precise as I wanted. So I actually tossed that out and I unpicked it all and I started over. So there's that question, answers that question. Is it okay to unpick? Do you ever unpick? And absolutely. I don't necessarily unpick because something's a little off. If it's a little, if a little mistake, something squamps a little bit, it will actually usually be hidden and no one's going to see it. But if I just don't love the quilting design, I'm going to sit and I'm going to stare at that for the next 10 years and wonder, why didn't I just start over? It's not going to be worth it to me. So I will pull out quilting if I get something going and it just is not working. But I really still wanted to stick with these squares. So as if you watched the last video, one thing that I really like to use is I like to do a little echo here. And this is going to really make that shape stand out. It's not going to get lost in the designs that butt up against it. But I also really don't like to cut thread. So when I'm doing a square inside of a square or echoing like that, I'm going to try to find places to jump in. So I did go ahead and jumped in the corners there, and it doesn't look off at all. It gives you a way to easily move and travel between those shapes. So I had that going, and I really looked at some of the circles and the different areas that I had on my last quilt, and I do love circles and borders. So I went ahead and extended more squares in here. Let's really accent that shape. If that's what I'm focusing on, let's throw some more windows. This also breaks down the shape. Every time you break down the shape, it allows you to focus on a smaller area, and it's less overwhelming. So by going ahead and throwing some more circles in here, some more squares in here, it allows me to break down the shape. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and extend the lines into here, and you'll see why as I go ahead and draw the next thing. So I was going to do the circles, and I knew I wanted to do those circles and just do a border of circles. So I was able to use the circle shape to then move. That did mean, however, I was marking out all of those squares ahead of time. So like I said, this would ended up with a lot more marking than I originally intended, but I think it was worth it. So that is something to take into consideration as well. Do you want it to be super intricate with lots of marking and lots of rulers, or do you want to be able to just more freehand it? So that's something to think about when you're doing it as well, and coming up with your final plan. So I went this far, and I was deciding, okay, but what am I going to do in the rest of the shapes? Now that I have this square that I didn't like this, what am I going to do next? So I kind of talked about it on my swish video, because if you haven't watched that one, go ahead and watch it. It's got a lot of good tips there as well. But one thing that is very important when it comes to design is repetition. So I've got these squares here, and I'm like, well, let's see, now that they're all here, it actually gives me 4 more points. And the last one, in my original Whirl quilt, I focused on the white and let these shapes stand on top of it. This one, I actually didn't do that. I went ahead and worked over the top of them, and I thought, okay, I've got the square here. What I decided to do is I'm going to put another square inside here, and I'm going to just use the edges of those squares I created as my boundary. So this is now bringing in repetition by using those same shapes over and over. And of course, we all know that I'm going to echo that, because if I'm going to go through all the trouble of making a square where there isn't one, I want you to see it. And then just know that anytime I border that, I'm throwing in those lines so that I can move easily throughout it. So now I've got this square echoed by this square. I'm starting to break down those shapes. I also needed to look at my stars. These ones are solids, so I can do a little bit more with them. And I knew I wanted to kind of break up, and I treat it as a whole shape and kind of break it up a little bit. And we ended up coming in and doing some crossed lines here. This allowed me to break it down into different quadrants. It almost makes a 9 patch out of my star. I really like the contrast of that lines can bring, and the ability they have to lead your eye through. And this worked out really well to echo some lines along the star here. This created a lot of fun movement, and it actually connected all of these stars together. So I thought, okay, well, I've got these lines here, and I've got this kind of funky shape here in the middle, and I decided to go ahead and just continue them through the center. But I wanted them to look like they were connecting to all those lines going out. So broke the shapes down, and then connected them to the pieces that were around them. So now I've got these straight lines going through here. And this was actually, I put this in before I tried these lines, and I came up with this, and this is where the connection, I felt like it just wasn't there between these circles and these squares, this and this, like it just wasn't there, it wasn't happening. You can see how they don't really go together at all. And that's why this got thrown out. I loved this, wasn't in love with that. So I've got these shapes now. I've got this shape here that I'm breaking down. I've got this one almost completely figured out, and I've got this one pretty close to what I like. What am I going to do in here? Well, one thing that you want to also leave in your quilt is you want to leave some blank spaces. You want somewhere for your eye to rest. And I decided, you know what, these are kind of the perfect spots for that. But let's make sure we really define those shapes. So we're going to go ahead and throw in my 1/4 inch echoing on those as well. So that's going to give my eye somewhere to kind of rest in those little areas. So now I had to address this new spot that I had created. Since I didn't like the shapes before, I had to come back, and I actually had this on the machine. So I took my plexiglass, just a giant sheet of plexiglass, you can get them at any home improvement store, and I put it on top of the quilt and drew directly on it with a dry erase marker. And when I'm doing that, that allows me to see it with the elements that were there, because I'd already quilted those other things. I was able to see them together, and that helped me to look at what I liked and what I didn't like. So on this one, it was just a matter of breaking down shapes even more. Okay, well, let's see. I've got points here where these connect. All right, let's connect those and see what we think. Well, now I've got an octagon, and I was really kind of liking the way that went. That gives me some more shapes to look at, some more shapes to define. So I thought, okay, we're going to echo that and create a shape there. And as you can see, I'm just using the points that are there. Well, I've created a point here. How can I connect those? Okay, well, now I've created a point there. How can I connect those? So now I've connected those. And now you can see I've kind of got this thing going on that's happening between. I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to make these points kind of appear like they're coming up behind this? So I created a whole other row here, and that allowed a nice fat spot to kind of make this border. With this, I now have this outline, and I've just decided to go ahead and bring the circles right back into that. Makes everything feel very connected, like it's all part of the same design by allowing some repetition. So then I decided I wanted these yellow things to look like they went behind the border and then come back out. So I'm going to outline them, and I did stitch in the ditch here as well on all these shapes. I didn't stitch here, of course, but on the outside of them to really define them. And that was, and then so the same thing I do down here is going to be the same thing I do up here. And I really wanted to kind of just recede and give some density changes. I didn't have a lot of thick quilting anywhere. It was all more areas. So this, by putting in lines, that's going to connect the two areas, but also vary the density to give some contrast there to what's going on. Now, as you can see, magically, all of those shapes are filled in. So as I'm doing this, you might be thinking, well, how far apart do you know how to make, like, how do you know how far apart to make these lines? And I went ahead and I found that a 1-inch spacing, I can make these circles pretty round, freehanding them. If I get too much bigger than that, I'm not as good at keeping them fairly round. So when I'm doing something like this, I try to keep it to about 1 inch. And like I said, that's simply because I know that that's about my limit for size on making sure those stay round. I'm still practicing to go bigger. Smaller is actually easier to make those circles. So that's what I decided to go ahead and do here. And because I'm repeating the same design, and I knew I wanted those circles here as well, I have 1 inch in between there. So that's one of those things where kind of stick with what you're comfortable with in your skill level. If you're really good at making bigger circles, you can make them bigger. If you want smaller circles, go ahead and make them smaller. So moving forward, I knew that I needed to now address this. Okay, so I could address this as 1 shape, or I could address it as 2 shapes. And I thought, well, I really liked what I had going on here where it continued through. So I'm going to continue these as 1 shape, but I'm going to leave this little section separate. It's going to be part of this little medallion border that's sitting on top. It almost reminds me of like those light medallions that you would put on your ceiling around your light, and it kind of sits on top of the ceiling and really draws your focus to the center of that. So I decided that's what my shape here is going to be. It's going to be my medallion. But this one and this one, I was going to treat as 1. So I ended up outlining this. But because I had a lot of squares going on, I saw this as I was, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to really make a unique, different shape. And the thing that really happened with this quilt is I was piecing it out. You'll realize that there's so many different shapes to look at depending on how close you are. You can get together and there's some real small, like you've got this funky shape here, but then you back up and now you've got this shape. You've got this shape here all together, or you can get in closer and you see the little triangles and the little circles. So it really keeps your eye going over the whole quilt by mixing things up, making those shapes that can come and go. So I decided to make these squares. And what I did is I left the insides of these squares open still, and they become almost this like focal point and this whole new design going on top of the quilt. Because there's nothing there and there's a lot going on everywhere else, they become a spot that actually really stands out, and it creates this real funky square illusion going on, and then it helps to repeat all the different squares that you have going on in the quilt. So because I decided to do that, I just connected this shape out to that square, and then again the same thing on the inside. I'm going to echo that, and that gives me this new fun, I don't even know what you would call it, it's not parallelogram, this new fun diamondy looking thing. So I went ahead and echoed those because I want these shapes to stand out. If I'm going to take all the work to mark them, I want them to stand out. And because of the different areas, I was able to mark here, and then these, they filled in really very easily because I was just able to go off of wherever they met up. And when I echo, I do about 1/4 inch echo. I found to be a good outline if I'm just looking to outline a shape and to make it stand out. About 1/4 inch seems to work very well. If you want it to be more of a prominent empty space, you want to go bigger. But if you don't want it to read as empty space, you want it to read as an outline, that's the size that I go to more often than not. So I knew I wanted something to contrast everything else that I was doing. I didn't want to put the same shapes. I felt that would be, they would get mixed together too much. So I think about the things that I know that I can do really well when I was filling this in. And I love swirls. I think they're very effective and they fit a lot of places. So I didn't have any swirls on this quilt yet. So I went ahead and decided, okay, we'll throw some swirls in here. That's a background filler that I use. You'll see it on a lot of my quilts. I think they're beautiful. They work really well for me. I know everyone kind of gets their own favorite background fillers. And that's something that you'll notice as well. You know, if you look back at your quilting, you'll probably realize, oh wow, I do a lot of pebbles, or I do a lot of swirls, and that's totally okay. You'll also see yourself changing and adjusting over time. The more you learn, the more you experiment, those designs that you use all the time are going to change. And that's, you know, that's just part of the process of growth. So that's totally fine. Don't think that it's wrong if you use swirls on every single quilt that you do in 2019. Because 2020, you might have something completely new that you're doing. So for the most part, you can see I kind of have everything worked out. I did have these shapes here though that I wasn't really loving. They felt a little too empty. But how can I fill them in? I've got circles here, I've got filler here, I've got filler here. How can I fill those in without adding too much? And one thing that I like to do that with is I just went ahead and added lines. And the reason I like lines is they kind of hold it down and they make it look finished and done. They don't look like a spot that you just forgot, but it's not adding too much to look at. So as you can see, it now says, oh yeah, now that's finished, that's anchored, but it's not a whole other busy element to really take away. So if you have a spot where you're going, oh, what do I put here? I need something, but I don't want a lot. Try some lines, just straight lines. And I went ahead and did kind of echo the square shape there. So then I got quilting this and I looked at this and I realized this was too empty. I had these empty spots here. I love that they were kind of the focus, and this just felt too empty. It's not as bad here. If you look on the actual quilt, the spacing is more like this, and it was this huge empty square. And this is one of those things that you realize sometimes after you get quilting. When I'm doing it on my paper, because I didn't have the actual scale, it wasn't as obvious to me. So once I got them on the quilt and saw the scale, I was like, I need more. But I didn't really want to go too terribly crazy, so I just made the inside circle smaller. And then, of course, echoed. I can't not echo that one if I've echoed everything else. And I'm like, well, how do I fill this in? Could have done some lines, but they're right here next to these lines. What I opted for is, you know what? I'm just going to change the scale of something. So you've still got that repetition, but by changing the scale, it makes it look almost like a new element, but doesn't add busy, because it is the same element. That scale change is a great way to repeat that, make it all feel cohesive, and add a little bit more to it. So now I step back and I realize, oh crap, I'm going to be doing tons of marking. I'm going to be marking almost every single design on this quilt. And I took a big deep breath and I said, you know what, that's okay. And I'm really glad that I didn't shy away from this when I originally did it, because I absolutely love the outcome. It is probably one of my favorite quilts to date. It's also one of the more intricate. So don't be afraid to go crazy if you like that style. You'll learn some tips and tricks to make things go faster. By the time I'd marked all these ones up here and got to the bottom, I was definitely faster. I realized, oh, if I do it this way, then that's going to go a little bit quicker. And you'll realize those things as well. But if this is super, super overwhelming to you, don't try to do this much. It's totally okay to back off and do a little bit of a simpler quilting as you're learning and adjusting and coming up with things. Or have some sections be a little bit more detailed and some a little bit less, where you don't have as much marking. You just want to make sure that you're keeping things balanced. So don't have like one side here, keep it balanced throughout the quilt. And we'll talk about that as we go through some more of these as well. And focusing on balance and places that you don't want to make it seem too heavy. You don't want people to think your quilt's going to fall over. Yeah, so that's kind of my process of going through this. And like I said, don't feel bad if what you originally did not work. As you can see with these elements here, it just didn't work at all. They don't really connect. There's no cohesion there. So don't be afraid to throw out your first 2 or 3 or 4 quilting plans. Keep the things that you really liked, and keep playing until you find something that you really love. So again, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me. Also on our newsletter, we are going to have a spot where if you have questions on free motion quilting or any of the other techniques or things that you kind of see us using, we're going to try to incorporate customer questions into our newsletter every month, not every week. So go ahead and make sure that you sign up for that. You can do so through our webpage, through our homepage, and there's just a spot on the bottom and you'll see our newsletter. So I've got a bunch of free motion quilting questions going into the newsletter this month, and we'll talk about things like thread color and working across the quilt through the design. Some, kind of how do I come up with the design is one that a lot of people have asked. So if you have any specific questions kind of relating to that, or else things that I can answer in future questions like this, definitely let me know. So we want to hear those questions. We want to be able to kind of help give back and kind of make things a little bit easier for you. So please reach out, ask those questions, and if it's something that needs more of a longer explanation, we will definitely, like I said, we'll let you know, hey, we're going to throw this in the newsletter so that I can go on for 3 pages and it will be okay. If it's something that's more of a shorter answer, feel free to ask any questions here on our YouTube video, and I'll work on answering those questions as well. If there's a shorter answer, that we can type in just a little bit. So reach out, let us know what you think, and if there's any of our quilts that you've seen on Instagram that you would love to know how I came up with that plan, if there's a specific one that you want to see me kind of highlight, definitely reach out and let me know, and I'll put that on the list. I'm going to try to work on doing some that are a little bit simpler and quicker process, some of them that are a little more intricate, like our Whirl quilt here. So there's a good balance so that you're not always thinking that I only do crazy. I don't have the time to only do constantly crazy quilting. So I will focus on some of our simpler designs as well. So yeah, so let me know if there's a quilt that you see, if you ever see a quilt that you're like, hey, how did you come up with the quilting there? I would love to see a walkthrough of that. Let me know, and I'll make sure to add that to our list and get that added here as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Again, I am Kimmy, and I am with On William Street, so please check out our website. We have some free tutorials on there. Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any video that we post. Also, you know, we'd love to see you over on Instagram or Facebook, where we post lots and lots of pictures of all the things that we're doing and keep you kind of up to date on what's going on. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.